Happy Tuesday, happy May 5th to all of you. Today we are going to move on from talking about the drugs at the synaptic level and talk about tolerance, dependence, and addiction. Okay? So by the end of this lesson, you should know the definition of tolerance, addiction, withdrawal, physical dependence, and psychological dependence. So sometimes I think the words tolerance, addiction, withdrawal, they're all kind of used loosely when we talk about drugs, and their definitions aren't always clear. And I think sometimes they get mixed up. So we're going to really define those clearly and give examples today. So when we think about tolerance, if you think about a person who rarely drinks, right, and they can easily get buzzed on one can of beer, but someone who's a long-term drinker, they really don't even show any effects until they've moved on to like their second six-pack of beer, right? So there's a clear difference between those two people, and that comes from tolerance. So the definition of tolerance is the diminishing effect with regular use of the same dose of a drug, requiring larger doses to be taken to replicate the drug's effects. Okay? So eventually our brain adapts to the drug because it wants to offset the effects. It's called neuroadaptation. Okay? So if we drink alcohol quite a bit, our brain's going to eventually offset the effects of alcohol, so it adapts to it. But that means in order to get buzzed or to get drunk, you have to drink a lot more than someone whose brain has not adapted than they would have to. So that's why you see different tolerance levels between people. And we also know that higher and higher doses can harm your health and lead to, before I go to the next slide, I want you to look at this chart below. Okay, so you can see on the left side we have drug effect, from little effect to big effect. And then on the bottom we have drug dose, from small to large. So your first one, you have a small drug dose, but you can see you have a high effect. Then your next one, as your dosage goes up, you can see more and more drugs are needed to produce the same effect. So to get to that first high, or that first really good feeling, or to get to that level of drunkenness, you have to use a lot more, so it just moves on, okay? Which is how we can lead to addiction, okay? So addiction is a compulsive drug craving and use despite adverse consequences. So the person knows that negative consequences come. However, because of tolerance, because of that need to get back to that feeling, that same effect, they have to drink more. And that leads to addiction. Okay. And so we can see that users often try to fight their addiction, but they have trouble stopping. And before I move on, the chart at the bottom is scans of a brain. And you can see the first scan is no drug use. So there's lots of brain activity going on. The next scan is of a brain of someone who's addicted to cocaine, and it shows that 10 days without cocaine. So you can see their brain activity has really, really diminished as a result of their addiction to cocaine. But after 10 days without using it, you see there's a little bit of activity coming back. And then 100 days without using it, you see there's a lot more of the activity coming back. It's not to the same level, but that goes to show you how long it takes for the effects of that addiction to get to come off, right? And it ultimately is a biological thing that when you'll see there's varying rates of addiction, right? Different drugs are more addictive than others. We also know, and I think I'll talk about this Friday or next Monday, genes have a factor, social influences have a factor. There's a lot of different things that influence who becomes addicted and how addictive they are. But when you try to stop the drug, it leads to the undesirable side effects of withdrawal. So if you've heard of the term withdrawal, I'm having withdrawals, okay? This is the discomfort and distress that's following discontinuing the use of an addictive drug. So because you're already addicted, your brain is relying on that thing. The body is relying on that high or that feeling. The response to that drug's absence is physical pain, right? And intense feelings, right? And so I have some symptoms down here: sweating, anxiety, nausea, insomnia, decreased appetite, headache. All of these things can be signs of withdrawal. And if you remember at the synaptic level, okay, once that drug has interrupted the normal process of neurotransmission, our brain stops producing it. So when you stop the drug, you're just not getting that neurotransmitter anymore. That is how dangerous, that is why they are so harmful to our bodies, because they actually stop the production of natural chemicals that we need to function as normal people. And as you have withdrawals, when you have those feelings of physical pain, this is called physical dependence. So what this means is that you have a physical, you feel a need in your body for a drug, and you know this because it's marked by unpleasant withdrawal symptoms when the drug's not being used anymore. So you actually physically feel pain, and that's why you're dependent on the drug because it relieves the pain. Okay, and that's why it's so hard to become to break an addiction to a drug, because to have that physical pain and to know that it can be relieved by that drug, it's really dangerous. And you want to go back, but remember, to get back to that feeling, you have to use even more of it time after time. People can also experience psychological dependence. So, a psychological need to use a drug, right, such as to relieve negative emotions. Okay, so maybe every time you take the drug, you feel really good, and then when you try to get off, you have these negative emotions. You're depressed. You're really anxious, right? You just want to not be that way, so you take the drug again, and then the cycle continues. Okay, and this usually happens if you think about like stress relieving drugs like alcohol. Okay, so it's really hard to break that habit. So even though they're not physically addictive, so you don't have that physical dependence, these drugs can kind of become part of someone's life as a way to relieve negative emotions. So maybe you don't have the pain that's associated with physiological dependence, but you do have a different type of pain with psychological dependence. So the way that the American Psychiatric Association knows that someone is dependent on a drug, if you have substance dependence, this is in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. So this is how psychiatrists diagnose people with disorders. You have to have 3 or more of these indicators: tolerance, you have to have high tolerance, you have to have withdrawal symptoms, you have to have been taking the substance longer or in greater amounts than you first wanted to. So maybe you're like, oh, this is going to be a couple times, and then 5 years later. You have a failure inability to regulate your use, so you can't stop and start when you want to. You spend a lot of time trying to obtain the substance. You abandon normal activities because you just want to get the substance and use the substance, and you continue to use it despite knowing that it's dangerous. So what a psychiatrist is going to do is they're going to interview you, they're going to look at your past, your history, to find out whether you meet these criteria. If you meet 3 or more, you would be classified as having substance dependence. So in summary, tolerance leads to addiction. Attempting to stop addiction causes withdrawal, and withdrawal causes side effects that may indicate physical or psychological dependence, or physiological for physical. People don't choose to be addicted, okay? And that should be really clear, right? Someone's not like, I want to be addicted to heroin, okay? Understanding the brain chemistry, what happens at the synaptic level that causes addiction, is really important. However, by choosing to take drugs, you do accept the potential consequences of addiction. So it's certainly a possibility that a person could take a drug one time and not become addicted. It's also a possibility that the person could take a drug one time and become instantly addicted. And seeing the pattern that we've just laid out on the harm that it can do long term, it is really pressing to me. I think it's really important to think that addiction is not a choice. It's not something that you just choose one day, but it can just happen to anyone, and it has really, really major long term consequences. People start to sell their belongings to get right to get that high, but they have to get more, so they have to sell more, and they have to sacrifice more, and that's why it's so easy to become homeless, right? To get divorced, to have all these issues going on in your life as a result of drug addiction, because ultimately the drug becomes your master, right? Just like our brain coordinates all the functions in our body. Once we lose control of that and your brain can't do that effectively, life becomes really difficult to live normally. So hopefully today's knowledge helps you understand more about drugs, how they impact us, and this cycle from tolerance to dependence, and how that process works. So we'll continue on learning about types and categories of drugs starting tomorrow and the rest of this week.